Hi friends, I'm Abby and welcome back to my channel. Today, it's been a little while since I filmed, so I feel a little rusty, but we're going to be doing some long book recommendations. I've done a video recommendation for short books, so books maybe under 300 pages, books to read really quickly. I've done like slump busters, so books to get out of reading slump, but I don't think I've done like long book recommendations. And actually I feel like the winter and this like colder time of year, well, I know we're still in autumn right now, but like the colder time of year is like a great time to be diving into like some long epic books and like cozying up with these really long books. And for me, I really like a long book. I mean, I like a long book at any time of the year, but I really like a long book, especially because when you find a long book that's really, really good, and you can be like midway through and you can still have 300 pages left and you're like, this is like perfect because I'm having so much fun. I never want this book to end and I still have so much more of this book to go. And I can just stay in this world with these characters. I know that long books can be a little bit daunting. I know they can be daunting, and it's especially annoying when you pick up a long book and then it's just okay and it falls flat and it's just a little bit average. But when you get a very good long book, it's the creme de la creme. It is just perfect. It's just perfection. So as a long book lover, here are some of my long book recommendations, and I think these are all over 600 pages, so they are definitely on the long side. And the majority of these are fantasy, although I do have one sort of more historical fiction and I do have one thriller as well, but the bulk of all the other ones were in the fantasy. Okay, so starting off, I have Malice by John Gwynne. This is one of my favourite series, and it's the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen. And literally all the books in this series are quite long. They're all sort of 600, 700, 800 pages. And I love them all. I think the series gets better and better as it goes on. In this, you are set in this epic fantasy world, sort of medieval Europe inspired. And you have these two gods, one for good and one for evil, and they each have their pawns upon the earth. And at the beginning of the book, there is this prophecy that the Black Sun and the Bright Star are going to fight to bring back one that's going to bring back the evil god Asroth. And then you have multiple perspectives, and you also follow sort of like the empires and the empires at war in this land. And there are giants and magical creatures, and yeah, figuring out who the prophecy relates to, the different characters. There are a lot of characters in this, but by the end of the series, I was like, I love all these characters. I love them all because I just got so connected to them. I really like the way that John Gwynne writes. I find it very engaging. It's very fast paced. Although these are quite long books, I do think that they are very, very engaging to read, that you do not want to put them down because there's so much happening, so much going on, especially as you get into the second half of the series. So I would definitely recommend this if you are for like a fast paced but long book. Sticking with the epic fantasy, I also have The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. This is the first in a trilogy. You are set in this world where prior to the start of the series, there has been a change in the power structure, and magic and magic users are now more repressed and more sort of trained in these schools by non-magic users. And they come to learn their power, and then there is a lot of control over them. And then there is this growing threat from beyond the wall. You know that there is this wall that is protecting this world from this evil power, and there is this threat that this power is going to break through it. You'll follow our main character Dandelion and his couple of friends at this school, but it very quickly moves away from that and sort of like into a more quest and figuring out what's going on. And I really like this. I really liked our characters. It's very mind-bending that there's a lot to keep track of and a lot to get your head around, which is why I would recommend reading the series like all back to back. But it was like a lot. I had a lot of fun trying to like piece it all together. In a slightly different vein, I have Crescent City, House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. Bit different from the like very epic fantasy, although this is epic, although more on the urban modern side of fantasy, but again, chunky. And this is a fantasy romance following our main character Bryce. And at the beginning of the book, she is set a task to find out who is murdering different people around the city, and she is put on this task with Hunt Athalar, who is a condemned angel for actions that he has done hundreds of years prior to the events of this book. And you're following them and the twists and turns. There are like so many different magical creatures in this, so every form of magical creature is in this book, from the vampires to the witches to the mermaids all in here, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. I really love this one. I didn't have as much fun with the second book, but I would definitely recommend this first book. A step away temporarily from fantasy is I Am Pilgrim by Terry Hayes, and this is a political thriller mystery book, and you follow this. It's sort of like someone who's solving a case. You follow this man who works for maybe MI5, MI6, and he is tasked with figuring out this case. But you end up with lots of different cases of things that are happening all over the world, but they all end up linking together. And you're trying to figure out alongside him how these cases link and what's going on and how it all relates to each other. But it sort of combines elements that are very much relevant to our world. It's set in our world, but it's all quite realistic in some ways. So the back of the book says, a young woman murdered in a rundown Manhattan hotel, a father publicly beheaded in the blistering sun of Saudi Arabia, a man's eyes stolen from his living body as he leaves a secret Syrian research laboratory, smouldering human remains on a mountainside in the Hindu Kush, a plot to commit an appalling crime against humanity, one thread that binds them all, one man to take the journey. So I just found this really interesting. It was, again, very fast paced, very engaging, but it's a long book. It's like 800 something pages, but it's a book you fly through because you're so intrigued as to how it's all going to work and if he's going to be able to solve the case and save the world. And I found it very satisfactory how it all wrapped up as well. This is one of my boyfriend's favourite books. I think he's read this so many times, and each time he reads it in like 3 days because he just cannot put it down. He's one of those people that like never reads, and then when he does read, he binges. One of my favourites from this year is The Wall of Storms by Ken Liu. This is the second book in the Dandelion Dynasty. So I figured that The Grace of Kings was just a touch too short, so I had to mention the 800-page book. I'm not going quite as far as the two 1,000-page books that are the third and the fourth book in the series, but this one is definitely my favourite in the series, and it clocks in at like 850 odd pages. The Dandelion Dynasty is a historical fantasy based on the history of China. The first book sort of acts as a prologue, setting up the world and the series and it's sort of like a historical setting for this world. And then from the Wall of Storms onwards, you get introduced into more characters and and following sort of the consequences of that history and seeing these characters as they think back on that history and then actions from that. And I'd say that this is a very political book, especially in the first half. There's lots of politics going on as things are pieced all together. And then there's sort of a shift as it becomes a lot more action heavy in the second half. And I really thoroughly love this book. I really love the introduction of the characters that we got in this and just where it goes and the direction the series goes into and into for the rest of the series. So if you're after a long book and a long series in terms of that it's 4 books but 4 very chunky books, I would definitely recommend The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. Then a classic, but a classic for a reason. Well, there's not, at what point does a book become a classic? Because I mean, it's a classic of fantasy in some ways, but okay, not really a classic, but A Game of Thrones, and particularly A Storm of Swords, which is my favourite in the series. It clocks in over 1,000 pages. I did read it in 2 chunks because I had the British English version, which was A Storm of Swords split into 2. But when you combine it, it's like 1,000 pages, and each book in that series is very chunky. I read A Game of Thrones probably like 10 years ago now, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. It sticks with me. And it is one of the, I guess, more modern founding blocks of what fantasy is. I think quite a few people will have now seen the TV show if they have not read the books, but you're following predominantly in the beginning the Stark family, and they're based in the north of Westeros. And at the beginning of the book, the king who lives in the south comes to visit, and he invites Ned Stark to come back and be the hand of the king. And so the Starks and the family migrate to the south, where there is lots of political machinations that go on. There is also, like in The Shadow of What Was Lost, a threat from beyond the wall as these dark forces rise. And you're also following Daenerys, who is part of the previous ruling family, and she is in the south part of the world. It feels a bit weird to summarise Game of Thrones because it's Game of Thrones. I feel so everyone knows what it's about, but if you don't, then there's a summary of it. And A Storm of Swords, everything seems to happen in that book. Like that book, I feel as though every chapter there was a cliffhanger and I had to keep going. There was always some reveal, something happening, something dramatic happening. Like that book was just mind-blowing. So, and I remember reading that book really, really fast, considering as well how long that book is. and I just could not put that book down. I feel as though we've got to ones that are bigger and chunkier at the bottom of the pile, probably because they're the biggest and the chunkiest. I stacked them. Getting heavier, The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee. This is the first book in the 5 Warrior Angels series, which I think is soon to be complete because the third and final book is coming out in November. I've read the first 2 books, and this is quite an epic fantasy that combines so many elements of fantasy that I love. Like, there are so many buzzwords that you could use to describe this series. It's a multiple perspective series, and you follow different characters that are spread out throughout this world. And if I'm talking about the buzzwords, you have some characters that are based in this castle, which has lots of secret passageways, which I love that setting. I just love that setting. And then you're also following this boy that's raised in this small village, and you know that he is a lost heir of some kind, that there is a lot more to him than what he seems. And there's this prophecy around him or potentially somebody else, that there is this prophecy going around. And then there are these assassins. There's this religious aspect as well, that there is this religion that seems to have been interpreted differently between the different continents, and so they're at war with each other. It's quite brutal in places. It's brutal, dark, graphic. So if you're not a fan of that grimdark-ish thing, I'd say in this book there's only one chapter that was very grim, but book 2 got grimmer. The magic, these artifacts, these people that a lot of the time I did not know who to trust. I don't think I trust anybody in this series. I don't. They're all very morally grey. Very, very morally grey. And I'm looking forward to rereading it and then reading the third book, because this was so good. So good when I read it last year. I then have Priory of the Orange Tree. This is a standalone, very, very long book. Not many of them. I feel as though a lot of the time you end up with very large books in series, or like there might be a book into a series, but this is a standalone. I do believe that there is a prequel or a book coming out in the same world, but this does stand alone. In this, you are set in this world where there are dragons. You are following 2 sets of people. You follow some people from the east and some people from the west. And in the east, dragons are sort of more seen as not friends, but like they are perfectly happy with dragons. And then in the west, dragons are sort of seen as evil, and they are really scared of them. And so you follow people from both sides of this world, and both sides this, not conflict, but both sides this sort of culture around dragons. And then predominantly you are following 2 characters, one queen and her lady's maid. And the queen is still unwed, but she must conceive a daughter to protect her realm from destruction. But there are assassins that are at her door. That's where it starts, and then things definitely move along from there. Again, this is multiple perspective. I will say I think this one is stronger in the beginning and middle. The ending felt a little bit rushed. I think for me, the beginning and the middle made up for that slightly rushed ending. That I really liked the whole progression of the story, that I didn't mind so much that the ending was a little bit quick. And then another non-fantasy one that I have is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. This is the historical romance, I would say. In this, you're following a main character, Claire, and at the beginning of the book, her and her husband are reunited after World War II, and they go to take their honeymoon to Scotland. At which point Claire ends up going through some standing stones back into the 1600s in Scotland, and is transported back to this time and is thrust into this time and has to cope and deal with that time. And we are following her as she comes to terms with that, and then is attempting to get back to her time and her modern era in the 1900s, whilst also adjusting to the historical ways of life and her position in a society where the Scottish and the English were at war or battling consistently. I really liked the setting of the Scottish history. I found that it was really interesting to learn about that history at that time, and Claire, as well as a healer, sort of bringing her knowledge into the past, and the relationship that she makes with the Scottish whilst she is there, and seeing how it all unravels, or how everything pans out. And then to finish off, my 10th and I think the longest book on this list is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, the first book in the Stormlight Archive, which I am still actively reading. I am on book 3. I will read book 3. I bring it eventually. But The Way of Kings is Brandon Sanderson's epic fantasy series set in the Cosmere, and this one sort of binds everything all together. And again, this is multiple perspective, as it seems to be a theme for me and very large fantasy books, that they are multiple perspective. It is something that I really like, multiple perspectives. And in this, you have our main characters are Shalon, Dalinar, Kaladin. In the main, are centered around this place called the Shattered Plains, where humans are at war with these people called the Parshendi, and they're fighting due to the humans thinking that the Parshendi killed their king. And these battles have been going on for many years. And you follow Dalinar, who is part of the ruling class in this world and driving these battles. You follow Kaladin, who is a grunt and sort of a slave within this fighting force, and you follow Shalon, who is not actually on these Shattered Plains, and she is looking for a way to save her family and becomes a ward. It definitely expands a lot from there as we get into the magic and get into the history of the world and the lore and how it all connects together. So I would definitely recommend this if you're after a very long book, and I will eventually continue on and read book 3. So there we go. There are 10 long, chunky fantasy books and other genres that you could potentially enjoy on a cold, wintry, wet day. I particularly love at Christmas time reading a big book. I find that cozying up by the fire, when I've got that time away from work, I know I've got some time off, I can just be with my family and read a very chunky book. Like, I really like that. Because I know I can dedicate myself to that book over the Christmas period. But I do also know that some people like to read a lot of short books as we approach the end of the year, if they're feeling like they're behind on their Goodreads goal. But for me, it's a long book time. It's definitely a long book time. So let me know if you have read any of these, if you have any long book recommendations for me. I definitely have quite a few, I think, on my TBR, because I gravitate to the long books. When someone says, oh, read a book under 300 pages, if I get that in a TBR game, I'm like, under 300 pages? I don't own any. I don't. Like, 500-page books, sign me up. So there are some recommendations from me for some over 600 pages books. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my future videos. Bye!